This is Ricky Fromler. Over on my Twitch, I've been re-experiencing what Final Fantasy XIV has to offer by playing through the game on an entirely new character. He may be a pudding-faced piece of garbage, but at least he's got a nice smile. Now, as I was playing through the game, I naturally encountered the first dungeon, which is introduced at around level 16. As someone who's put over 5,000 hours into Final Fantasy XIV, Sastasha is something that I've become all too familiar with. Hell, I remember the exact pathing of the dungeon beat by beat. I've run it so many times doing dailies that I could probably complete it blindfolded. However, when I went through Sastasha on stream and re-experienced it for the first time on a fresh character, something dawned on me. Something which is very simple and very blatant. Sastasha is the tutorial dungeon. It's the baby steps, go at your own pace, hey, here's some mechanics, introduction, and I couldn't help but become fascinated by it. As much as I dislike Sastasha for being boring, for being easy, for being a total pushover in comparison to some of the other content that the game has to offer, I have to commend it for being a fantastic teaching tool, and here's why. Now, just imagine for a moment that you're a fresh-faced, bushy-tailed player who's picked up the game for the first time. You've had some struggles getting through the god-awful beginning of the game, you've got a hang of its main scenario storyline quests, and you're finally ready to tackle your first dungeon. Now, let's just assume you're a tank. You know the basics of combat, you know how to smack enemies with your sword or axe, you've experienced moving out of the glowy bits to not take damage from AoEs, but you've never been responsible for other players before. You enter into the dungeon, and it's not difficult to figure out what to do. There are enemies ahead, so you gotta kill them. Except, now there's a whole new side of combat that you haven't really had to concern yourself with before. Aggro. Or, well, enmity, as it's called in Final Fantasy XIV, but these enemies aren't just going to attack you. After all, you're not the only one there. Thankfully, you've received your first AoE ability and had some time to mess around with it. More enemies, use your AoE. Pretty straightforward. You quickly realize that the enemies are focusing you, so as long as you're in the tank stance and doing enough damage, that's fine. Great, that's a basic mechanic that we already kind of know. What I'm super interested in is how this dungeon introduces boss mechanics. Mechanics which will be prevalent for the rest of the game. Mechanics which you can find examples of even in the latest dungeon. Dealing with trash mobs is one thing, but dealing with a boss that's summoning adds or doing big boy damage is an entirely new experience that is almost exclusive to dungeons. You could argue that some of the story-based duties, which include boss fights, kind of lead you to learning these mechanics, but in those situations, you always have NPCs to do the heavy lifting for you. Everything in Sastasha is fairly straightforward. You follow the path and kill the enemies, but even something as simple as killing enemies becomes a teaching moment. These clams here will spawn enemies called Shadeseekers, and when a Shadeseeker dies, the clan will enter a defensive mode where it's impervious to damage. When it opens its mouth, 2 more Shadeseekers will spawn, and the clam will be vulnerable to damage once more. The idea of using trash mobs like these to introduce the concept of spawning additional enemies or adds is genius in my opinion. It sets the stage for what's to come. It teaches the player what to expect. The first real hurdle comes when you're faced with these 4 colored pieces of coral. Anyone who's playing this game knows by now that the trick behind the corals is in the beginning of the dungeon. There's a discarded note or parchment which contains the correct color. But would a new player know that? Or would they even care? I certainly wouldn't. I'd arrive at the corals and just start picking at random, which brings up an interesting action consequence into the dungeon. Sure, you can do it correctly and progress, or you can fuck it up and fight some extra enemies. Does this sound like a minuscule punishment? Absolutely. But that's the point. The game is teaching you that the dungeons might not be as simple as you first conceived. There might be decisions that you have to make, clues that you have to find, puzzles that you have to solve, all of which might reward you. Eventually you'll bumble your way through finding which coral is correct, and the way forward will be revealed in the style of a switch. When you interact with the switch, An enemy will spawn, and you'll be met with a mini-boss, which serves as the second surprise in the dungeon. The way this enemy appears makes it clear that it's not just a trash mob. It has more health than them, it engages in unique AoE attacks, and it has a veritable battle arena which is sectioned off after a short time. Once again, so what? Believe me, I get that. This is all just basic, simple mechanics that the game employs, but remember, we're talking about an entirely new player who has no idea what to expect. The game is teaching them mechanics and rules that will apply for the rest of their time in Final Fantasy XIV. Once the mini-boss is down, there's some more trash mobs to take care of before you reach the first official boss, Captain Madison. As far as boss fights go, it's nothing special. Madison is flanked by 2 pirates, and the fight is rather simple. Madison doesn't really have any special attacks. He and his cohorts just kinda smack the tank until they're dead. Except for one special difference. Madison doesn't die. Instead, when he reaches a low enough threshold of health, he'll instead opt to run away through the back door, and the way forward will be revealed. The second part of this dungeon is something I find very interesting, because it introduces a mechanic which is rampant throughout almost every other dungeon. Pick-up items. You fight a bunch of mobs, and once they're all dead, they drop a key to the captain's quarters, which is being guarded by 2 more enemies. Dispatching them and opening the door reveals a large enemy who serves as our second mini-boss. He's bigger, has some marauder moves, and takes a couple seconds to take down. He then drops another key, a key which you use to progress to the next boss fight. It seems kinda silly, but introducing these mechanics of dropped items in the first dungeon was a fantastic idea on Square's part. They use it so often in the future that teaching it to the players immediately is a very smart idea. Is it a good mechanic? That's debatable. I personally find the idea of having to pick up keys to unlock doors to be very tedious and boring, but the fact that they go to the effort to teach it to you in the very first dungeon is at least commendable. The second boss fight is a rematch with Captain Madison. At first, it simply appears to be the exact same fight, 2 of his men and himself wailing on you until you overpower them. However, Captain Madison and his men have a few new tricks up their sleeves. They'll deal more damage, use special attacks, and when Madison goes beneath a certain health threshold, he'll summon in adds to help deal with you. The mechanics we learned at the beginning of the dungeon are now being implemented in a boss fight, which just got marginally harder, and that's pretty fucking cool. The third and final area of the dungeon teaches you about patience, and shows you that not every enemy needs to be defeated. You can take your time to pick off the parties of enemies that lurk in this cave, and by keeping your distance and hugging the wall, you can actually avoid 2 entire groups of enemies and move straight into the final boss. The boss arena is fairly large, and you face off against Den the Orca-Toothed. The area has grates around it which have interactable points called unnatural ripples, which are seemingly inactive. Now, Den serves as the accumulation of all the mechanics that we've learned thus far. He has special attacks, AoEs, and when he reaches a certain health threshold, he will activate the unnatural ripples, which begin to bubble. The mechanic is that you need to interact with them to stop the bubbles. It takes a couple seconds and gives the healer and DPS things to do. If the ripples aren't dealt with, an enemy will spawn, and the tank will have to aggro them, which just elongates the fight. Finally, you defeat Den, and with him slain you can exit the dungeon and your time in Sastasha will come to an end. Now, I get it. A lot of what I'm saying seems like common sense, but I'm not here trying to blow anyone's mind. All I want to do is show appreciation for how the fundamental dungeon mechanics in Final Fantasy XIV are taught to the players. I just thought it was neat. Thanks for watching, and feel free to catch me on stream sometime, twitch.tv/RickyFromLA.